Well, the federal government is being urged to nearly triple its efforts to protect land and water in this country from development. Currently, about 11.8% of Canada's land mass is set aside for conservation. In New Brunswick, it's 4.6%. But a new report by CPAWS, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, says that isn't enough to stop what they call a nature emergency. Roberta Clowater is the executive director for the Society's New Brunswick chapter, and she's on the line. Good afternoon.
Hi, Vanessa.
So what do you mean by a nature emergency?
Well, we're calling it a nature emergency because we want to increase the level of attention and urgency that people have when they think about what we need to do to protect nature. There has been a lot of talk globally and in Canada about calling what we're doing with climate a climate emergency. And because the potential collapse of nature and climate change are so intricately intertwined, we feel it's important that we also be thinking about them in lockstep with each other because they feed off each other in either a positive or a negative way, depending upon what we do about it.
So let's take New Brunswick as an example, if we could. Give me a sense of what's happening here.
So in New Brunswick, we know that there are more species being added to the species at risk list. For example, some of the insect-eating birds, songbirds like swallows and swifts, are now endangered and have not previously been endangered. The Atlantic salmon populations in the rivers that flow into the Bay of Fundy are endangered. We have endangered marine mammals. We have coastal birds that are endangered, piping plovers, for example. And at the heart of all of these wildlife species that we see in the decline is concern about loss or degradation of their habitat. There are also other things that feed into the mix, and that's pollution and toxins and other things. But we do know that protected areas is seen as being one of the most important solutions to helping to stop the loss of wildlife.
Lots of concern, obviously, about our wildlife. What are the implications for human beings if we don't ramp up conservation efforts in your mind?
Well, the natural areas that surround us, that often we think of as home for wildlife, is actually part of our own life support system. So we really rely upon the natural areas around all of our communities in New Brunswick to protect us from heat waves, to protect us from extreme cold, to help prevent flooding, to provide habitat for pollinators that ensure that we have a stable food supply. There are all kinds of things that we sort of take for granted, don't think about all the time, that we get for free from nature. And if we don't start dealing with our nature emergency, both in New Brunswick and across Canada, we are going to have to start putting millions and millions of dollars into replacing some of these services that we currently get for free.
We've been talking about, climate change and issues like this for a number of years now. What makes it different now? How dire is the situation?
I think that what's happening now is we have the problem with nature conservation, so the fact that we're experiencing collapse of some habitats and natural areas and also species, and climate change are happening at the same time, and they're in a bit of a negative feedback loop where they're feeding off each other. So problem when natural areas are not as healthy, they are not doing as much to help us stop climate change, and they're also not doing as much to help protect us from climate changes, the impacts of climate change. And then on the other side of the coin, climate change is making species loss and habitat degradation worse. And so they really do need to be seen in a very cohesive way, and we need to have action plans for both that recognize the role they're playing to each other. And scientists have been producing a lot more reports in the last few years to try and showcase that link, to try and help people understand what's actually happening and what kinds of actions we need to take so that we don't get to the point where these have spiraled out of control.
New Brunswick is at 4.6% in terms of the land that it has set aside for conservation. That's a lot lower than the national average. How much of New Brunswick's land would you want protected?
Well, we know that New Brunswick can easily get to at least 10% of the province in protected areas before 2020, just with areas that we've already identified, that scientists have already identified as being important, in the Restigouche Wilderness, for example, or wild rivers that protect salmon habitat, drinking water supply areas, old forests and wetlands. There are significant areas all around the province that are already in the mix and people have identified, and we know what's there and we know why we need to protect them. What we need now is the political will in the province to actually have an action plan for New Brunswick that fits in with what's happening in the rest of Canada. All of the other provinces have announced what their action plans are going to be to try and tackle Canada's nature emergency. So we need New Brunswick to now step up and say, okay, this is our plan, this is what we're going to do, and if we can at least get to 10% within the next couple of years, then there's more scope. All the partnerships will get developed, and we'll start building the relationship with Indigenous people that we need to actually scale that up and make it increased as the next decade goes on.
And what are you hearing from the province on that?
Well, we do know that they have expressed some interest in conserving more land, and they have been participating in some of these nationwide meetings that have been happening with other governments over the last 2 years. So we know that they are in there and having discussions, but they haven't made their intentions known publicly. So until something's public, it feels like it's not really a commitment at this point. So we think that to get that political will, we're really going to need more vocal public support. I mean, we need more people talking to politicians about the need to do something on both the nature side and the climate side together. And the more people talk about this, I think the more politicians will respond positively and see that this is the way that we do things. This is the new normal, is that we actually need to address what's happening with that life support system that we all depend upon.
We'll see what happens. Listen, thanks so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Vanessa.
Roberta Clowater is the Executive Director for the New Brunswick chapter of CPAWS, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society.